Ever wonder what would happen if you were accused of a crime in medieval times? What if you were a woman? The medieval justice system wasn't exactly known for its fairness, especially when it came to women. Let's take a journey back to a time when justice wasn't blind. It was heavily biased against the female gender. Number 9. The infamous double standards of medieval courts. Did you know a woman could be executed for killing her husband, but a man might only face a fine for killing his wife? It's true. In medieval Europe, when a woman killed her husband, it wasn't just considered murder. It was classified as petty treason. This was because a wife was expected to be subordinate to her husband, making her crime essentially the same as rebelling against a lord or king. Joan Beaufort of Westmoreland was accused of poisoning her husband in 1396. While male murderers might face a quick beheading, women found guilty of killing their husbands were often burned at the stake, a much more painful and prolonged death. Men who killed their wives, however, were typically charged with simple homicide. Take the case of Richard Smith from York in 1389, who beat his wife to death in a drunken rage. He paid a fine and performed penance, but kept his life. Court records from medieval England show numerous cases where men were given minimal punishment for violence against their wives, while women faced the harshest penalties possible for similar actions against their husbands. This double standard extended beyond murder cases. Women who committed adultery could be severely punished, including public humiliation, whipping, or even execution in some regions. Men's extramarital affairs, however, were often overlooked or treated as minor offenses. When Geoffrey Chaucer wrote about the wife of Bath in the 14th century, he was highlighting a rare exception, a woman who managed to navigate through male-dominated society with some agency. But even his fictional character faced constant scrutiny and judgment for behavior that would have been acceptable for men. Number 8. Trial by ordeal. Especially cruel for women. Have you ever been so desperate to prove your innocence that you'd grab a red-hot iron? In medieval times, when evidence was lacking, courts often turned to trials by ordeal to determine guilt or innocence, and these were especially problematic for women. One common ordeal was carrying a red-hot iron for several paces. The wound would be bandaged and checked after 3 days. If it was healing cleanly, the accused was considered innocent. If it was festering, they were guilty. The records of Eleanor of Aquitaine's court show several women subjected to this ordeal when accused of witchcraft or infanticide, crimes almost exclusively attributed to women. Another ordeal involved being thrown into a body of water. The logic was perversely simple. Water, being pure, would reject the impure, guilty person who would float. An innocent person would sink. Yes, you read that correctly. Sinking was the desired outcome. If you wanted to prove your innocence, women accused of witchcraft in particular faced this swimming test. In 1215, a woman named Agnes from Norwich was subjected to this ordeal after being accused of using magic to cause a child's illness. She floated and was subsequently executed, despite her continued pleas of innocence. What made these ordeals particularly unfair to women was the medieval belief that women were physically weaker and more susceptible to supernatural influences. This meant judges often interpreted the results with bias. A woman who managed to hold the hot iron without showing pain might be accused of using witchcraft to numb the pain, rather than being recognized as innocent. Between 1208 and 1276, court records from the English county of Bedfordshire show that women were twice as likely as men to be found guilty when subjected to trials by ordeal. Number 7. Witch trials. The ultimate sendibiosed prosecution. Did you know approximately 80% of those executed for witchcraft in medieval Europe were women? The witch hunts represent perhaps the most gender-biased form of justice in medieval times. While the major witch-hunting crazes peaked in the early modern period, 1450 to 1750, their foundations were firmly established in medieval attitudes toward women. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, explicitly stated that women were more susceptible to demonic influence because they were more carnal than men and intellectually like children. This theological justification led to systematic persecution. When crops failed or children fell ill, local women, especially older widows, midwives, or those with knowledge of herbal medicine, became easy scapegoats. Take the case of Guileless Duncan in Scotland. This young healing woman was tortured in 1590 after her employer became suspicious of her ability to cure ailments. After days of sleep deprivation and having needles thrust into her body to find the supposed devil's mark, she confessed to witchcraft and implicated others, setting off a chain reaction of accusations. The very nature of witch accusations made them nearly impossible to defend against. How does one prove they didn't attend a midnight Sabbath with demons? Women accused of witchcraft often faced damned if you do, damned if you don't scenarios. If they confessed quickly to avoid torture, they were executed. If they maintained their innocence through torture, this unnatural resistance was taken as proof of supernatural protection from the devil. What makes this particularly tragic is that many accusations stemmed from women's traditional roles. Knowledge of herbal medicine, midwifery skills, or even being too outspoken could lead to suspicion. The medieval court records of Montalieu in France show that women who gathered herbs or assisted in childbirth were disproportionately targeted when the community needed someone to blame for misfortune. Number 6. The impossible standards of women's crimes. Ever heard of a crime that only women could commit? In medieval justice systems, certain offenses were essentially female, exclusive, creating entire categories of criminality that men could never face. Infanticide stands out as a prime example. When an abandoned baby was found, local authorities would typically search for unmarried women who had recently been pregnant. The presumption of guilt fell heavily on single women, widows, or servants. In 1276, Alice of Wickenbrook was charged with infanticide after local children found a dead infant in a roadside ditch. Although she maintained that her baby was stillborn, the court determined she had committed murder. The standard of proof was remarkably low, often just the existence of a dead child and a woman who had recently given birth without a husband's protection. What made these women's crimes particularly unfair was the lack of consideration for circumstances. Many women accused of infanticide were servants who had been impregnated by their masters, or women in extreme poverty with no means to support another child. Yet the courts rarely considered these factors. Between 1270 and 1348, court records from the English county of Essex show over 40 women executed for infanticide, while not a single man was held accountable for abandoning a child during the same period. Sexual crimes also fell disproportionately on women. A man and woman caught in adultery might both technically be guilty, but women faced harsher social and legal consequences. In some medieval towns, adulterous women were forced to wear distinctive clothing or badges, marking their crime, while their male partners faced no such public shaming. The town records of Avignon in 14th century France detail how adulterous women were paraded through the streets wearing only their shift's undergarments, while the men involved frequently escaped punishment by paying fines. Prostitution presented another double standard. While technically illegal in most medieval jurisdictions, it was often tolerated as a necessary evil. However, the legal punishments fell almost exclusively on the women, not their clients. In 1351, London authorities conducted a sweep of the Southwark brothels, arresting dozens of women, but not a single male patron. When punishment came down, it was the women who faced whipping, head shaving, and banishment. Number 5. The legal non-person status of medieval women. Would you believe that in medieval law, married women essentially ceased to exist as independent legal entities? This concept, known as coverture, meant a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She couldn't own property independently, sign contracts, or participate in court without her husband's permission. When Margaret Paston, a 15th century English noblewoman, needed to defend her family's property during her husband's absence, she had to act in his name rather than her own, despite being the person physically present and making all the decisions. Her letters reveal the frustration of having to constantly reference her husband's authority, even when he was hundreds of miles away. This legal non-existence created profound vulnerability when women were accused of crimes. A married woman charged with theft might be technically defended by her husband, who could claim she acted under his direction, but this defense removed her agency and reinforced her subordinate status. Court records from 1356 in York show a case where Emma Thornton was accused of stealing bread. Her husband Thomas claimed she was acting under his orders, which spared her punishment, but reinforced her lack of independent legal standing. For unmarried women or widows, their legal vulnerability took a different form. Without a male relative to speak for them in court, they often faced prejudice from all male juries and judges. When Catherine Lanesale, a widow, brought a case against her neighbor for theft in 1398, the court records note that her testimony was considered less credible due to her female condition and lack of male protection. This lack of legal personhood created a catch-22 for women accused of crimes. Either they were responsible for their actions and thus fully culpable, or they were acting on behalf of men and thus reinforced their subordinate status. Either way, the system was stacked against them. The legal records of medieval Ghent show that women appearing in court without male representation were twice as likely to receive maximum penalties compared to women represented by male relatives. Number 4. Tortured confessions. Gender-specific methods. Have you ever wondered why medieval torture methods were different for women and men? While judicial torture was commonly used against both genders, the methods applied to women often exploited gender-specific vulnerabilities and reflected deeply ingrained misogyny. Women accused of serious crimes like heresy, witchcraft, or treason faced torture methods designed specifically for female bodies. The breast ripper, for instance, was a particularly gruesome device used almost exclusively on women. This iron claw would be heated and then used to tear off the accused's breasts. Records from the 1420s show this torture was used on women accused of heresy in parts of Germany and France. Sexual humiliation was another common tactic used disproportionately against female defendants. Women would be stripped naked before interrogation, supposedly to check for devil's marks, but clearly intended to cause shame and break resistance. When Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, was imprisoned in 1430-31, her guards kept her naked and chained, ostensibly to prevent escape, but also as a form of ongoing psychological torture. Women's supposed weaker nature was exploited during torture sessions. Interrogators believed women would break more easily under threat, so they often began with elaborate demonstrations of torture devices rather than immediate application. Court records from the Inquisition in Toulouse show how Beatrice de Planisels was forced to watch others being tortured before her own interrogation began, a psychological tactic rarely used on male prisoners. The threat to children was another gender-specific pressure point. Women with children might be tortured in front of their offspring, or vice versa. In 1428, Guillemette Guibert, accused of heresy in Tournai, confessed after inquisitors threatened to arrest her young daughters. This tactic exploited women's maternal roles in a way that had no equivalent for male defendants. What's particularly disturbing is how these gender-specific tortures were justified through pseudo-medical beliefs. Medieval experts claimed women had higher pain thresholds for certain types of torture but lower resistance to others, allowing interrogators to cherry-pick methods they claimed were appropriate. Between 1356 and 1422, judicial records from various European courts show women were subjected to water torture, at nearly twice the rate of men, because it was believed their moist humors made them particularly vulnerable to this method. Number 3. The respectable witness problem. Did you know a woman's testimony in medieval courts often counted for less than a man's, if it counted at all? This created a nearly insurmountable barrier for women trying to defend themselves against accusations. In many medieval jurisdictions, women were either barred from testifying in serious cases or their testimony was explicitly given less weight. The 13th century legal text, Fleta, stated that in English courts, the testimony of 7 women was equivalent to that of 1 man in certain cases. This made it nearly impossible for women to mount effective defenses when male witnesses testified against them. When Agnes Banastre was accused of poisoning her husband in Yorkshire in 1397, 5 female witnesses testified to her good character and offered an alternative explanation for his death. The court dismissed their testimony as womanly sentiments and gave greater weight to a single male neighbor who claimed he had seen Agnes handling suspicious powders. The problem became even more acute for women of lower social status. A servant woman accused of theft might have only other servants as witnesses to her innocence, but their combined testimony might still be outweighed by a single accusation from their employer. In 1348, Matilda Wells, a kitchen servant in a noble household, was convicted of stealing silver despite 4 fellow servants testifying they had seen the steward, who accused her, take the items himself. For women accused of sexual crimes like adultery or prostitution, this witness problem created an especially vicious circle. Respectable women were discouraged from associating with fallen women, meaning those accused of sexual misconduct often had only other disreputable women as witnesses. In 1376, when Cecily Wakefield was accused of operating a brothel in London, the testimonies of all 6 women who lived in her house were dismissed because, as the court record stated, women of questionable virtue cannot be trusted to speak truth in matters affecting their livelihood. What's particularly interesting is how this issue played out in ecclesiastical courts, which handled many cases involving women. While church courts theoretically allowed female testimony, in practice they often required female witnesses to have male sponsors who would vouch for their credibility. The ecclesiastical court records of York, between 1300 to 1399, show that women's testimony was dismissed for lack of male corroboration in over 60% of cases where women were the principal defendants. Number 2, punishment, disparities, public shame, and female bodies. Would you believe that even when convicted of identical crimes, men and women often faced dramatically different punishments? Medieval justice systems frequently designed punishments for women that emphasized public humiliation and targeted female sexuality. Take theft, for example. A man caught stealing might face a fine, imprisonment, or in severe cases, hanging. A woman convicted of the same crime often faced punishments that involved sexual humiliation. In some German towns, women convicted of theft were stripped to the waist and paraded through the streets before banishment, a punishment rarely applied to male thieves. In 1385, Marjorie Collins was caught stealing cloth in Bristol and was paraded through the market with the stolen goods hung around her neck, her hair shorn, and her breasts exposed. A punishment designed to maximize female shame. Adultery punishments showed perhaps the starkest gender disparities. In many medieval communities, adulterous women might be forced to wear specific clothing marking their shame, have their heads shaved, or be paraded nude through town. Men caught in identical circumstances typically paid fines or performed brief penances. The town records of Augsburg show that between 1300 and 1378, 87 women were publicly shamed for adultery, while only 9 men received any punishment for the same offense. Crimes involving speech like slander, gossip, or verbal quarrels resulted in particularly gendered punishments. The scold's bridle, or branx, was a metal cage placed over a woman's head with a plate that pressed down on her tongue to prevent speech. This punishment was exclusively used on women, reflecting medieval anxiety about female speech. Men who engaged in verbal disputes typically faced fines rather than devices designed to physically silence them. Court records from Edinburgh show this punishment was used over 30 times between 1450 and 1500, exclusively on female defendants. Even the death penalty was administered differently, based on gender. Men condemned to death were typically hanged, beheaded, or, in extreme cases, drawn and quartered. Women were more often burned at the stake, especially for crimes like husband, murder, or witchcraft. This wasn't merely tradition. Medieval legal commentaries explicitly stated that burning was more appropriate for women as it preserved bodily modesty. The body would be consumed by flames rather than left hanging exposed, and was considered more terrifying, thus serving as a better deterrent for weak-minded women. The punishments for infanticide were particularly severe for women. In 1329, Johanna of Wells was buried alive after being convicted of killing her newborn, a punishment that male murderers never faced. Between 1270 and 1348, court records from England show that women convicted of infanticide received on average punishments 40% more severe than men convicted of killing their own children, in the rare cases where men were charged with this crime. Number 1. The ultimate injustice. When victims became the accused, have you ever heard of a rape victim being punished for the crime committed against her? In medieval courts, women who were victims of sexual violence often found themselves transformed from victim to defendant. When a woman reported a rape in medieval times, she faced an uphill battle from the start. Many jurisdictions required her to raise a hue and cry immediately after the attack, rushing publicly into the streets to announce the crime. Any delay in reporting, perhaps due to shock, fear, or embarrassment, could be used to dismiss her claim entirely. In 1313, Marion de la Barrere's rape case in London was thrown out because she waited until the following day to report the attack, which the court deemed suspiciously delayed. If a woman became pregnant as a result of rape, this was often considered evidence that she had actually consented, based on the prevalent but wildly inaccurate medieval belief that conception required female pleasure. Court records from 14th century France show multiple cases where pregnancy was used to dismiss rape charges and sometimes even lead to charges against the woman for making false accusations. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly rape victims could find themselves accused of fornication or adultery. If they couldn't definitively prove the encounter was forced, an almost impossible task in an era before forensic evidence, they might be punished for illicit sexual activity. In 1382, Alice Perez reported being raped by 3 men, but couldn't provide witnesses to the attack. The court not only dismissed her case, but fined her for lewd behavior after the men claimed she had consented. For unmarried women, reporting rape carried the additional risk of ruining marriage prospects. This created a perverse situation where families sometimes preferred to arrange marriages between victims and their attackers rather than pursue justice through the courts. The ecclesiastical court records of York contain at least 12 cases between 1300 to 1399 where rape cases were withdrawn after the families negotiated marriages between the victim and attacker. Women from marginalized groups faced even greater injustice. Jewish women, Muslim women in Christian territories, or women working as servants had virtually no chance of successful rape prosecutions against Christian men or employers. In 1267, Rebecca of Winchester, a Jewish woman who accused a Christian merchant of rape, was not only disbelieved but charged with attempting to extort the man. She was flogged and banished from the town. The ultimate injustice appeared in cases involving powerful men. When Isabel Batiller accused Sir William Beauchamp of rape in 1292, she was imprisoned for defamation. Beauchamp claimed she had invented the accusation after he refused to pay her for consensual sex. The court accepted his version without investigation, and Isabel spent a year in prison. Court records across medieval Europe show a consistent pattern. The higher the social status of the accused man, the more likely the woman would end up punished instead. What does it say about a society when those brave enough to report crimes against them risk becoming criminals themselves? How many women stayed silent rather than face such a justice system? And how much has really changed since those dark medieval days?